Good evening. Been a while since I've been up in front of a crowd, so if this is a little rusty to start, I apologize, but it'll get rolling. So, alternative comedy, what is it? And if you're not hearing that in Dave Foley's voice, what are you even doing here? So, as defined by the creators, alternative comedy is considered comedy that's non-racist, non-sexist, unstructured, unhacky, surreal, and as the kids say, punk AF. So we are, if I have my notes in order, which I don't, we are talking about 5 locations over roughly 3 decades. So we're starting off in England, London over here with the Comedy Store, which was kind of a transplant from LA. And this is, we're talking like the very tail end of the 60s, 1969 into the 70s and then into the 80s. So late 60s, mid 80s. And then we're going to come back to North America in the mid 80s through the 90s, starting in Toronto, then New York, LA, and Chicago. And these are the main 2 players, Comedy Store and Second City. There are other clubs involved, other troupes, but these are the main players here. So we're also talking about not just the clubs and the troupes, but the alternative cabaret that was set up in London, and then later in LA, there was something called Uncabaret in '88. We're more of like incubators. So not so much about the club, but about people coming together and just throwing stuff out there and seeing what worked and developing this kind of humor. So here we go with our key players. You might be able to tell which ones are my favorites. And I've also abbreviated with the UK because I didn't have room to put England. So it all starts in 1969 when the Monty Python's Flying Circus airs on the BBC. These guys were surreal through the roof. If you've never seen Python, which again, what are you even doing here? Sketches with no endings, interstitial things that like tied everything together that consisted of really surreal, bizarre animations from Terry Gilliam. They're not really considered part of the alternative comedy scene, but they're definitely the forefathers. They're definitely where this all kind of comes from. And if you ask most of the other performers in this genre who their main influences are, they're gonna point to Python. So, let's see. From there, we are headed into the 80s. With, again, the alternative cabaret, which is where we start seeing the seeds of this group known as the Young Ones. Started off performing at the alternative cabaret as a double act called 20th Century Coyote. They picked up Nigel Planer and Chris, not going to remember his name along the way, and put the Young Ones together. One of their head writers, Ben Elton, was the youngest writer ever hired by the BBC. He would have been like 19 or 20 at the time. And he is really key over here with this other group on the right top for Blackadder. He was one of the main script writers for that. And so we've got players in here like Stephen Fry, Hugh Laurie, Rowan Atkinson. All these people have been influential for forever on the alternative comedy scene. And although initially it does look like a slide full of a bunch of white dudes, there is an element. The voice of diversity starts to come through, especially with the queer voice, with Graham Chapman, Stephen Fry, Scott Thompson from Kids in the Hall, and Kevin Allison from The State over here, which we haven't gotten to yet, but we're headed right there. The other key players in North America, of course, Kids in the Hall, my beloveds. And they started in 1989 when their show debuted on HBO and the CBC. Again, they were huge followers of Python. And they made a very deliberate choice, though, with their show to not emulate them. So they made sure that all of their sketches had a beginning, a middle, and an end, including the sketch that Kevin McDonald wrote, where he described how his sketch didn't have a beginning or an end, it just had the middle. The joke being that the beginning was the description of how it didn't have a beginning, and the end, of course, he brought up his mother to evoke sympathy, to keep the audience going so that he could make money and support his poor mother. So there we go, Kids in the Hall. And then shortly thereafter, in New York, 1993, we've got The State. And they started at New York University calling themselves the Sterile Yak. Just crazy, surreal stuff. And these guys, a lot of these people that you see here are gonna have influence for years down the line, and especially The State, but really all of them. Let's see, here we go. And there are so many people to name that you just can't get to them all, but some of the more recognizable, like later down, late 80s into the 90s. Again, forgive the the UK substitution for Britain, but Susie, Eddie Izzard, is one who's known fairly well to American audiences as a queer performer, been a cross-dresser, as self-described, trans performer. And then you also have French and Saunders, Jennifer Saunders and Dawn French, and probably Jennifer Saunders is a little more accessible to American audiences thanks to Absolutely Fabulous, again, very big in the queer community. In the US, again, this is kind of subjective, if you read my bio, kind of the people that you know, stand out to me. Janine Garofalo, you can't argue that she wasn't influential in the United States on the alternative comedy scene. She, you know, started really early on performing with Ben Stiller and Bob Odenkirk from Mr. Show. She's just been all over alternative comedy. And Mark Maron, funnily enough, as prickly as he can be, seems to have a way of getting people together and getting them to open up and talk. So he had a lot to do with getting the scene off the ground. And yeah, that will come up again later as well. All right, so from the US, we go back across the pond, and we're talking now about like the very kind of mid to late 90s into the 2000s. Some of these shows, American audiences are really gonna not be that familiar with, but we're talking about a group of people that were creating comedy in England that are influencing things today. Simon Pegg would be a huge player in this. He started with Asylum, and Spaced, I think, is one that American audiences would recognize a little better. But we've got a huge cadre of players here. Simon Pegg, Julian Barrett, and Noel Fielding, who went on to do Mighty Boosh. Julian Barrett comes in here with Asylum, A Natural Acts, and then we're introduced to Rich Fulcher, Jessica Hines, who, again, maybe not that recognizable to American audiences, but if you watch anything that Simon Pegg does closely, you'll see her. She's in there. In Shaun of the Dead, there's a group that kind of follows them, kind of mirrors them, what they're doing, and she's the leader of that group. So that's Jessica Hines, and she also starred in Spaced with Simon Pegg. You guys, there's so much stuff. I had so much trouble like paring it all down and deciding what I needed to talk about, but these are the people that I love, the people that I think are really funny. Take it and do with it what you will. There's black books. See, there were a couple of things that I couldn't put up there, or that I didn't put on the slide, that I thought were really notable too. In 2000, we've got black books, which again, it stars Dylan Moran, but you see Simon Pegg again, and here we start to see Martin Freeman. There's another show that started in 2000 called Bruiser, which was Martin Freeman, but it also introduced Mitchell and Webb, who we first see in Peep Show in 2003, but they had a radio show, they had the Mitchell and Webb look, they were all over the place. And that's also where we're introduced to Olivia Colman, who should be accessible to most American audiences as well. Then again, Mighty Boosh in 2004, Garth Marenghi's Dark Place in 2004. If anyone's seen that, yeah. I don't even know what it is. So imagine if Stephen King had his own sci-fi based TV show in the 80s with the worst production and acting possible. That's Garth Marenghi's Dark Place. It's beautiful. It's a masterpiece. And here, we're seeing some of these players again, but we're also seeing Matt Berry, who is probably most recognizable from What We Do in the Shadows these days, the TV version. Stephen Merchant, and then Richard Ayoade, another one of my favorites, who shows up in the IT Crowd in 2006. So you've also got Chris O'Dowd, you're seeing Noel Fielding again, Matt Berry, and Katherine Parkinson as Jen, who's really underrated. But the other thing that didn't end up on this slide, 2007 in the States was Flight of the Conchords, but I put it with this group because they had a BBC radio series in 2005. That's kind of where audiences first saw them. Here's another fun one for me. Because there is a huge tie-in between the alternative comedy scene and the alternative music scene. And it starts as far back as the Young Ones, but it's a long tradition. With the Young Ones, and then Viva Variety, which was a show on Comedy Central that was formed by members of the state. They both were variety shows, so they featured a musical act. On the Young Ones, you saw Madness, Motorhead, The Damned, so you've got this wide range of ska music, metal music, punk. On Viva Variety, there was Fishbone, They Might Be Giants, Ween, how do you define Ween? But alternative nonetheless, Chibo Matto, people like that. And then if we go back to the Janine Garofalo and Mark Maron connection, there was another thing that came up in New York, I think it was 95, called Luna Lounge, and it was another one of those that was more of an environment. It wasn't so much about the place or the people, it was just the performers were getting together to just throw stuff at the wall and see what stuck. They were kind of just playing off of each other and doing it for each other. And that's where a lot of the alternative comedy style kind of incubated. But Luna Lounge was set up as a venue that featured music and comedy, so it'd kind of do back-to-back, one comedy, one music. And we're seeing a lot of alternative music again here. They featured acts like Elliott Smith, Interpol, The Strokes, Yeah Yeah Yeahs, and the music was always free. You had to pay to see the comedians, but you could get in and see the music no matter what. And then we have some of my favorites, who are by no means fully representative of the alternative music scene, but you can't argue that they don't masterfully bring comedy and music together. Weird Al, of course, as a standout, starting in the 70s, you can't underestimate how much influence he had on pretty much anything comedy. And then They Might Be Giants come along in 1982, just brilliant at what they do, taking these super bubbly, jangly songs and putting the darkest lyrics to them. I mean, they're just the best. Then we're coming back to Flight of the Conchords, who kind of showed up around 2007 for US audiences on HBO. And then Reggie Watts, of course, hanging around in the early 2000s in New York, just doing amazing things. Musically, these guys are all super talented, but also just funny, like just hilarious stuff. Again, very subjective, so here we go. What has it wrought? A little bit of everything. Here's the thing about where alternative comedy is today. Some of this has been like way underground, but it influences almost everything you see. We're starting with podcasts in 2005, like the Thrilling Adventure Hour. 2009, Comedy Bang Bang, which started as a podcast. 2012, we get Welcome to Night Vale. They were just here yesterday, I believe. So, and we've got web series like Derek, which featured Donald Glover. The Maria Bamford Show, which was wonderful. If you haven't watched it, you can catch it on YouTube. Dealing with mental illness in the most beautiful way. Drunk History, of course, featuring all kinds of players from everywhere. Broad City was another one that started as a web series. Animation, my favorite. Alternative comedy is all over animation with My Little Pony and Cheese Sandwich. That's Weird Al, for those of you who don't know. Adventure Time. I can't count how many comedians you're going to find on Adventure Time, and they're all brilliant and they're all wonderful. Even Steven Universe has Joel Hodgson, the original host of MST3K, as the mayor in their city. And then BoJack Horseman, of course. Paul F. Tompkins being one of the major players in alternative comedy today, from podcasts to web series to animation to you name it. Even TV and movies, a lot of these players, especially from the London scene, are part of the Harry Potter, for better or for worse, series, and also the Neil Gaiman projects that have been up, like Sandman and Good Omens. And then, of course, my absolute favorite right now, Our Flag Means Death, featuring lots of ties to Flight of the Conchords, as well as other alternative comedy sources. And that does it for me. Thank you.